Hello listeners, I am your speaker Casey, and as many of you may know, I am currently undertaking the Psychology of Coercive Control Master's course at Salford University. I hope that this course will make me more informed and better equipped for future projects and interviews on the podcast. In the meantime, I will be releasing renewed versions of older episodes with updates from previous guests. If you want to find out what I remember from the time of each interview and get in-depth updates from the guests, I've been writing blog posts as I go through older episodes and adding them to my website, cultvaultpodcast.com, which you can also find links to in the episode description. You can find links on my website for support on navigating recovery from cultic abuse, to learn more about how to help a loved one, or become more informed about the subject of cults and coercive control. My emails are still open, and I am carefully curating a list of guests to speak with once I am back to interviewing officially next year. You can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com if you'd like to get in touch. And now, on to today's updated episode. Hi Teddy, and thank you so much for joining me today. We are diving further into the subject that is the Unification Church, and I know that you are a fierce advocate when it comes to shedding light on what the heart of this religion really looks like. So, would you like to start by introducing yourself to our listeners?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Teddy Hose, and I am, let's see. Oh, wow. Where do I start? Yeah, I guess I'll start by saying I have been, I grew up in the Unification Church, which is led by Sun Myung Moon, who believes he's like the second coming of Jesus. And so I grew up in Tarrytown, New York, where his family has his estate. And we grew up in one of the houses that the church is on there until I was 13. And then we moved to Seattle, and I moved around a bit after that. Now I live in New York. And just about maybe a decade ago, I kind of decided that I'm a writer and an artist. So I decided that I should talk about my upbringing. Like, that's something interesting. It took me a long time to realize, like, maybe I should talk about that, and that would be interesting. Like, to me, it was normal. So yeah, that's what I do. And by day, I just do, like, I'm a designer, like a motion graphics person. That's kind of a sum up.
I've been watching you talk about your upbringing on various platforms. I've referenced quite a lot of the appearances you've made in things like the Cults and Extreme Beliefs documentary. There's the explained episode on cults that's available on Netflix and YouTube that I referenced you on in my very first episode when I was talking about what is a cult, just explaining sort of the etymology of the word and things like that. So my roots are all tied up in this episode. So it feels like this is really exciting for me to be able to have this discussion today. And I just know you're going to give the listeners some insight that we haven't had yet, even though I have previously covered the Unification Church. So if anybody wants to go back and to listen to those episodes, they're also really interesting, but this one's going to be fantastic. So for those who might be unsure what the Unification Church is, who Sun Myung Moon is there a way that you could briefly summarize the practices and beliefs of the Unification Church?
Sure, yeah. Sun Myung Moon, he believed himself to be, he died in 2012, but he believed himself to be the second coming of Jesus. He's originally from what is now North Korea, Busan, and it was there in his teen years. He had that revelation, and ever since then, he's just kind of preached his own gospel. He gained a following in Korea. And then there's some, I don't know the full story, but there were some ties with like the Korean CIA or something where he was being an influential person. And I think there's these theories, or like there's some research about how they turned him into an agenda to get, I guess, maybe to empower their nation or something, or try to take over other countries or something like that. Sun Myung Moon moved to America in the late 50s, I believe it was 1957, to, spread his unification movement. And, that was kind of, he was getting into the hippie era. So that's where, like, my parents joined in the 60s. yeah, and it just kind of it spread around in America when, like the Beatles had like, the what was it? They found their guru, and some cult experts say that they credit that as like what made the '70s all about this, big guru craze of like people were consciously looking for that. So Sun Myung Moon was there at the right time, and yeah, but who he really was, and this is from a book I read called um, "Change of Blood Lineage of Ritual Sex in the Unification Church." He had these kind of bizarre sexual. He believed he had sexual powers, and that like there was a purification if you had sex with him. So, and this was actually kind of a thing in Korean shamanism at the time. So, he came in under the guise of this conservative, like Christian figure, but really, there was weird sex stuff in the church, and that some of that is actually coming out. And a lot of other cults have this too. All these stories of people coming out and talking about strange sexual abuse, and so I'm only starting to see that now. But yeah, that's, I guess, to give you a sum up. And he also made a lot of money. We grew up going to these really fancy properties, but it was all from exploited money from labor trafficking from people who got witnessed into the church and convinced that, working constantly for the church was like the best thing they could do for God. It was, legit thought reform or brainwashing. So, yeah, I grew up in a family that, we eventually left, but I guess I'll get to that later. But that's to try to sum up. Yeah.
In the clips I've watched, Sun Myung Moon does come across as having those characteristics of a charismatic leader. I think that I actually read about some of the sexual ritualistic stuff, and it was, I think, is it called the Picarium doctrine or something similar to?
Yeah, I think that's how it's pronounced. Yeah.
So it's something to do with Sun Myung Moon can cleanse your womb through sexual intercourse, which is really strange because in the actual principles of the Unification Church, it's all about becoming pure through marriage because sex before marriage is impure. So it feels very hypocritical in that sense. And I was very surprised when I read about all the infidelity that Sun Myung Moon has been accused of, but I'm sure that's also something we'll get into a little bit later as well. So I'm sure you can summarize it a bit better than I can, what the belief system is of the church itself.
Sure. Yeah, the belief system is if someone gets, well, it's based on the Christian, the Christian doctrine of Adam and Eve. They sinned in the Garden of Eden, and from there, that's where humanity sprung. And so, the world is sinful. But the Unification Church believes that they had or Eve had sex with Satan and then had sex with Adam. And so that's where the evil blood lineage came from. And so Jesus was supposed to cleanse all of us of that. But according to the Unification Church, he failed because he got crucified. So whereas I guess maybe most Christians say like, oh, that's a great holy act. But Sun Myung Moon thought he was supposed to have like a family and live on until he died and purify humanity. So Sun Myung Moon claimed that he was taking on that mission, like probably hundreds, maybe thousands of other cult leaders out there. So somehow Sun Myung Moon got ahead. And yeah, so when you get pulled into the church, when you have children in the church, they are born with pure blood. So that's the agenda, we're only allowed to marry people who also come from the Unification Church with the pure blood, quote unquote. So they were very strict about, that was one of the heaviest, things in the church is like, don't have sex outside of marriage to another second generation. So that's pretty much, the basis of it right there.
In order for me to become pure, I have to be in one of these marriages. And kind of, I know that Moon died in 2012, but he would be there to conduct this ceremony. and then any of the children that I would have with that husband inside of the Unification Church, that baby would be born without sin and be born pure.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's right. Yeah.
What does Moon claim? Like, how does he claim to have the ability to cleanse people of their sins just through kind of these processes of marriage and things like that? Has he claimed to be sort of like a Messiah, or kind of a chosen disciple of Jesus or God?
Yes, so basically, now we're getting into weird, bizarre sex stuff. There was something called holy wine. So this was believed to be the cleansing, if you drank it, then you would be cleansed of, I guess it was kind of like something that would help you birth someone who was cleansed of original sin. So the myth, the story, no one knows yet if this is totally true, but a lot of people have stories, but is that, with Sun Man Moon believing he had sexual powers, supposedly his ejaculate is in the wine. And, at least in the early days, I know it's awful. In the early days, it was like that. And I think what they do is they pour the wine into like a bigger pool of wine or something like that. And then it basically eventually, there's no trace of it. But yeah, that was the way you were supposed to be cleansed.
I have not heard about that. So that's really, at least there's like a physical, I mean, that's disgusting and a really like hard to think about, that if that's actually what happened, but at least there's actually a physical explanation on how he expected this to happen and wasn't just saying sort of, I'm Jesus reborn, and I have the power to cleanse you all through mass wedding ceremonies.
Yeah, at some point it went into candy, or maybe they were manufacturing candy that maybe had holy wine in it or something. Yeah, people would go door to door and give people candy, or like they would have a little thing of grape juice that they'd pour for people door to door and be like, drink this. And it's like, who are you? Like, I mean, of course there was
strange.
It's all symbolic. I think the church just kind of, the more the church like loses power or whatever, the more they change the rules to try to keep the power. So they'll be like, okay, it's symbolic now. Or, even the pure blood lineage, they were like, okay, there's a forgiveness ceremony if you had sex before marriage. Like, they're just like, come on, just stick around. Like, who knows if they'll eventually accept gay people, because it's like an anti-gay church, unfortunately, so yeah, I don't know how far they're going to keep compromising.
Oh, it sounds very similar to, I did some coverage on Aum Shinrikyo, and I talked a lot about how the indoctrination process worked with that movement. And Shoko Asahara would apparently get people to drink sort of this concoction that had his blood in it. They would store vials of his blood, and there would be a drop in sort of the chalice that you drink from in the initiation process. So I'd never heard of semen, though. That's a new one for me. I was surprised about that. I don't know. Am I surprised? I am. I'm shocked, but I don't know if I'm surprised. But you mentioned before that your parents joined in the 60s. So did they know each other at this point, or did they meet sort of through their church involvement?
They met through their church involvement. One big thing I forgot to mention is, the Unification Church is known for its mass weddings. So in the stadiums, if you see that in any kind of encyclopedia or like online, that's the one. So yeah, my parents, it's kind of interesting actually. They were of the first flock of Unification Church members. So they were like respected as like elderly or older members. And, so I think we had some privileges from that. I'll admit that. We kind of grew up in like a pretty nice house in Tarrytown, New York, until my parents left the church when I was a teenager. But so they met in San Francisco. My dad had just moved down there from Seattle. Just he was a hippie and he was, looking for himself and trying to be an artist. And he was doing okay actually. He was kind of in the right circles, like close to like Janis Joplin and West
Wow.
psychedelic posters. Yeah. So like he was hanging out and like living in the same spaces as like these people. And until he met God, So yeah, some Korean woman walked in and, witnessed to him one day. But my mom is from Japan, so I'm half Japanese. She just she was the really determined one in her family, and she wanted to go to a good school and like find God and everything. And yeah, she just got, I guess, sent to America to help with the effort here, and they worked at the same church center. And you would think that there would be arranged marriages back then more, but it sounded like in the earliest days, like my mom kind of chose my dad. Like she actually proposed to him. Like she wears the pants in the family. That's just kind of
Yes.
precedent. Yeah. So like yeah. And then I heard other couples also kind of picked each other and they just asked their leader if it was okay, like their local church leader, if it was okay. And like, so I was like, I guess it wasn't always matching, but yeah. So that's how they met. And then
Wow, she sounds like such a strong-headed woman, your mum.
I actually you probably watched Wild Wild Country?
Yes. Yeah. I
I
actually just
describe
watched that about a week ago.
Oh, cool. Okay. Yeah, I really like that documentary because it really showed all the aspects. It wasn't just like cult bad. It was
Mhm.
like people
Mhm.
are emotionally invested in this.
Yeah, I completely agree. I watched the first episode and it was it was Sheila talking about her perspective.
Mhm.
And then I was thinking, okay, so the second episode is going to be from the perspective of all the people that think it's really bad, but it didn't go that way. It just kind of carried on taking snippets from all angles. So yeah, I agree with what you've just said. But
Yeah.
who would you compare her to from that documentary?
So my mom is kind of, I think, on par with Sheila. Like, there's like an old church archive site, T Parents. It means like true parents. That's what we called Reverend and Mrs. Moon. tparents.org. And there's old archives of her speeches, and it's just like it's so depressing to read. It's just she was so deep into it.
Hmm.
Like when you're feeling bad or something, or you feel like you're not enough, just think, what would true father do? Basically, like just like but she being kind of a strong-headed woman, and she's smart. My mom's very smart. Yeah, I think she maybe more than my dad. I don't know. I think maybe both of them just eventually left the church. They just were like, this isn't what we signed up for. It was really hard, but they did. But yeah, she is. I think there's a few Sheilas in Unification Church, but my mom was definitely one of them. She was like, I'm going to be loyal, like super loyal. And that's kind of a Japanese thing too. This is extreme loyalty to where like, you do seppuku or, kamikaze, like it's like you die for the cause.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so that's good for some things, but other things, man.
I think that's so interesting because when I watched that documentary, I almost thought that Sheila was I almost could have, if I would have dipped in and out, I would have come in and said that she's the charismatic leader of that movement.
Yeah, I tell people, I'm like, that documentary is about Sheila. Like, they hardly ever show anything about
The
this show.
whole thing was about her from the start to the finish. Um, yeah, the way she speaks, is extremely charismatic. I was sat there thinking I could listen to you all day, and then I was like, is that a good thing? I don't know if that's a good thing, but that's how these things work, isn't it?
I don't know if you can hear this, but I'm in an old, like century-old building, and there's a radiator that's like gurgling right now.
No, I can't hear it. If anyone else can hear it though, then at least we know what it is. It's not me with a hungry belly.
Okay.
So, when your parents meet, they get married with permission from the leader. Everyone's okay with it. Your mum proposed to your dad, which I think is awesome, considering how many years ago that was as well. And it seems to be more of a common thing in this day and age, more so back back then. So that's awesome. And how many children did they go on to have? How are you an only child, or are there brothers and sisters?
I have 4 siblings in my immediate family, but and this could be its own podcast episode. One of my biological siblings was given away to another family, and that's a common thing in the Unification Church, like because it's all one big family, like one big it's trust circle. If someone can't have a baby, then sometimes a family will give one of theirs to that family. It's called offering child. So there are offering children, and this person, anyway, it's kind of a long story, but yeah, she didn't know until she was a teenager, and and now she like lives around my family, getting to know us. We kind of come from different scenarios, so different kinds of families. Like her mom was like a very powerful person in the church, and ours, we left the church, so there was a lot of negotiation kind of in integrating her into the family. But now I think now things are pretty good, and we pretty much see her as like almost like extended family kind of.
And did you know growing up that there was a sibling who was kind of somewhere else?
I'd heard about it here and there, but I guess until I was maybe in my teen years, and then people started talking about it more. And I went to a workshop and I saw her, and she said she kind of had a crush on me. So I was like, oh no.
Goodness, that's so, and that probably comes from like misplaced, because she felt something familiar towards you, which just turned out to be that you're brother and sister. So that's really interesting.
It's kind of a common thing I heard of in families where someone's adopted. Like the reunion experience is like, it's so emotionally, it's such a big thing. Or maybe there's that similar resonance, and then because you feel like you're not related to them, maybe it turns into that. I don't know, but.
Are these things like monitored though? Because if 2 people meet each other and then get married and then have children, is there no like that could have happened with the 2 of you? Like, is there a way to? I don't know. That's a bit weird to think about, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I think in this, usually the kid knows that they're adopted, but I think this particular mom, actually, I read this about cults. There's this one cult researcher or expert who's also a therapist named Roseanne Henry, and she had a similar situation, but she had like someone in the cult that she was in. She coerced basically her to give her daughter to the leader person, and the leader person like excommunicated them and didn't want the daughter to know that she was part of another family. That's kind of what happened with our family. Like it was like, don't ask, don't tell. And we were all afraid of, my biological sister's mom, of her finding out and like, being like, don't screw it up, So when I read about it, I was like, oh my God, this is a pattern. And anyway, it was interesting.
That is really interesting. I mean, already in such a short time, you've given me so many new pieces of information that I didn't know about, and I thought I'd done extensive research on the Unification Church. So this is just so fascinating for me. So you grew up with yourself and 3 siblings, and you had one sister who was living with another family.
Yeah, we grew up in New York till I was 13, then Seattle, or Bellevue, right outside Seattle. And the whole time my biological sister was in Berkeley, California. That was like another kind of church kind of hub, where a lot of people got, my parents got witness to in San Francisco, which is right across the bridge from Berkeley. So, yeah.
Would you say that New York was the prime hub of activity for the Unification Church?
Yeah, I would say, for sure. That's where the Moons live. That they own this building called the New Yorker Hotel. They still own it. And I think Wyndham, I think it's called, hotels, they use it, but I think it's still like properly owned by the Moonies, or the Moons. So we would go there during church holidays. The church had its own holidays like Parents' Day, and they called New Year's God's Day. And we would, yeah, actually, that was one of the perks of growing up in the church. You go to this prestigious building and you're like, wow, this is like ours. Like, and the kids just played around in all these, in the grand ballroom. And like, we were just kids, like going to these different floors with these ornate, like gold furnishing, it's totally just like this palace, but it was all just a huge facade, built on exploited money. And like, we didn't own any of it. We were just people who were working for the church. So, I don't know. It was fun to go to the city on weekends or stuff, or I mean, on church holidays just for that. But yeah, that was our lives. Like, and then we go to school and just like try to hide the fact that we were Moonies because we lived in that town. So,
okay. So
yeah.
Did you access public school?
Yes, we did. The way I describe Unification Church a lot is like, it's kind of like Scientology where it's trying to like get in with pop culture. So at least in my family, I think it varies between families, but in my family, like they were a little loose about, getting into this or that show or music. I mean, my parents had some restrictions, but like, yeah, we tried to keep up with things to be like marketable to like people.
So the aim behind that is that you can go to school and witness to people almost about sort of the
Yeah.
the religion and the things that you're involved in. Not just you specifically, but I mean just being integrated with the general public.
Yeah, I mean, the way it worked is like in that, like, just north of New York City where the Moons lived and where a lot of church family lived around them. It was more than witnessing because like everyone knew the Moons were in that area. It was more like we just had to hide that we were in the Moonies because we were all afraid that our teachers were gonna, call us out or something like that. It was actually a really, I grew up with a lot of anxiety and distrust of it. Today it's turned into some social anxiety. Thank God I went to college and I drank a little and I made friends and, I learned how to trust the world a little more. But before that, yeah, just going to school near the Moons was just, all you had was each other. So it was like, it made you bond even more within the church and trust the church even more. So yeah, that's just kind of how life was like there. But yeah, when I went to the West Coast, when we moved to Seattle, the church leader there was like, he talked about something called like natural style witnessing, where basically it's like all your friends are potential recruits. And actually, by that time, I was kind of pissed off and I was like, no, man, I'm not going to do that. Like, screw that. Like, I have a life and I don't want to freaking, I mean, I said it in a polite way, but yeah, no thanks.
So it's interesting what you just said about becoming closer to each other, because a lot of I've spoken to a few ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, and they've said that, some of them have said, I've been homeschooled because my parents didn't want me to be interacting with worldly people, which I say in inverted commas, such as myself. I'm a nice worldly person. And so they're homeschooled and they are almost isolated from things like pop culture. But then you're going to public school, and because of the anxiety that came with your identification with the church, that the sort of level of control is still there because you're bonding more with the members of the Unification Church in fear of being kind of outed in school. So that the effect is still the same. You're not being restricted from interacting with worldly people, but because of the worries that come attached with those interactions, you're still not interacting with worldly people.
Yeah, I hear that's the thing in quite a bit of cults. Even like some of the LGBTQ kids who grew up in the church, they said like going to church like summer workshops, which is basically like Bible camp, or going to church events was like an escape from their own families, where they felt like they were invisible or just, didn't exist pretty much, or had to hide who they were. So and those bonds are still going to this day. Like a lot of people kept their friends because I think almost everyone I know who grew up in the church just left. They were like, you go to college, and I think the church, they want us to go to good colleges and stuff, so that I think it's like a status thing for them. But what they don't realize is that we learn like things that are totally against what the church stands for. So we all get smart and we all make friends with people. We don't have to come back home to our parents and have to like, behave for them. And it just, yeah, people, that's kind of like where people take off. And so, yeah, I forgot where I was going now, but yeah.
And when you speak about your parents marrying and having the kind of the leader's blessing, and then you're living in a house that's owned by the Unification Church, how does that gap get filled? How do your parents kind of receive extra responsibility within the church to kind of move up the ranks, so to speak, and become closer to the inner circle?
Well, we almost never saw my dad growing up. He was, sometimes I call the Unification Church the Church of Bad Dads, because like it's everyone, in a lot of cults, a lot of the men will try to, if it's a male leader, which usually it is, they'll try to emulate the leader. And the leader is this, he's just this guy who's totally full of himself and he thinks he's saving the world. And I've never seen him be really a father. Like it's always just been like self-promotion. Like you don't see or hear about, he talks about love and everything. But so, my dad, he, one time I actually interviewed him for some personal project I was working on. And I was like, what was your childhood like? This is the first time I've ever heard him talk about his childhood. And he was like, well, I got passed around a lot, because my mom was too poor. And I was like, oh, like, so passed around between like aunts and uncles. And he was like, no, my mom would find like classifieds in the paper and I would just get passed around as like a foster child until I was 9. So I was like, that explains so much, because he just had no radar or like signal of being a father. He just, I don't know, that's the thing. But it was actually really good to know that, because I just didn't know. I was just angry. I was like, you didn't raise us really. You just you provided for us through this church, and then you expect that like you get to be our dad. Like, no, or to act like nothing's wrong. So yeah, my dad was just gone a lot, and my mom sometimes my mom grew up in a more kind of stable family in Japan, and she stuck around a little bit more. And when she did get asked to go on these missions, like in other countries, to, hold workshops to witness to people and stuff, she was a little more hesitant, or, she would talk to us and be like, I'm sorry, I have to leave, for a few weeks. And I remember like my sister was crying, or, my mom was the more stable presence. So, we had like church caretakers for like 2 or 3 years at a time. We had a different person. It was almost like at home daycare. So it was very communal in that way. Yeah. But yeah, my parents, like, it wasn't until I went to a proper therapist, I learned like predictability with parents is really important, and it's gonna hurt your sense of trust in relationships if you don't have that. And I'm like, well, there it is, like something I'm working on. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I've read some of your work where you mentioned when both parents would have to go and work away, and you would kind of be passed for to different caretakers. So it's unfortunate that your father grew up so poor that he had to be passed around, but then you grew up with a father that had so much responsibility that even though you lived in a nice house in a nice area and were provided for, the same thing almost happened despite the difference in financial stability.
Right.
But did your father have to do this traveling because they were both so strong-headed that they worked their way up through the ranks of the church to to be given this extra responsibility?
Yeah, I think my mom was more like that. I personally, I think that my mom maybe has issues with her own father. She would tell me about her own father here or there. Once she mentioned that he just was like, he was this guy who came home, and this is in Japan. And in Japan, I think the mom, I read a New York Times article actually, like not too long ago, it talks about how the mom is just expected to run the home and to take care of the kids. And the dad just goes to work and comes home. And that's his role. So I think there was that playing into it too. Um, where was I going with that? Yeah, my mom I think she was the one who was more pushing him up the ranks. And I imagine also because he was an artist and he spoke a certain way, he's very charismatic. He's he sounds like a very humble person. He's very unassuming, my dad, and to a fault. It's gotten them into some like issues with door-to-door marketing and stuff. My mom always has to chime in. Now he just hands the phone to her and she's just like, no. But yeah, again, she's like the Sheila. But I think, yeah, she was just like steering that ship. And my dad was like the lead singer and she was like the producer, like making everything happen. So yeah, he was the face and she was the brain. Yeah.
And did your father spend one-to-one time with Sun Myung Moon? Is that how far up he managed to get at one point or another?
Yeah, I heard that they would have like dinners with him sometimes and talk about, the different plans they had. Like my parents were in it. They wanted to make the world like a better place. Like I think some people joined because of like the power and the money and whatever. But and I think for my mom and dad, what they had with that is security. So there was power and money. So they did have like a place where they could feel really empowered. And that's where I can't really hold it against them because they both came from poor families. So, no, my dad was, his title was managing director at the World Mission Department. So this is with, one of Moon's cronies was Reverend Kwok, who, so my dad worked for him and he's like, yeah, he's one of the big heads who has like this, beautiful mansion in Terrytown and, not too far from the Moon's estate. And he worked directly with him. And my dad would also fly out to other countries, like in Africa, or he would go to the Philippines or, and just give these workshops. And, my dad always claimed like, I didn't want to witness to anyone. I just wanted to spread good word or like life lessons or something like that. And I'm like, it's in my head. I'm like, but it's a cult and you're making them warm up to a cult leader. Like, I don't know. I think it's really hard for my parents to face. They can't believe. I don't know that they'll ever digest it. And a lot of my friends say the same things who grew up in the church. They're like, I don't want to confront my parents because that's all they have. And like, if they realize that it was all just like this mafia family they were working for, then they'll just like be so distraught in their golden years. You want them to, it's like, let them have their like lie, or let them have their, beliefs about what they did and why they did it. I don't doubt that there were moments of kindness and everything like that, but what it was rooted in was the problem. So,
And have you had any type of conversation with you? Well, you mentioned that you've interviewed your father for some personal work, but have you ever sat down and had this kind of conversation with them about your thoughts and feelings growing up in the church and how those things affected you? I mean, because you've spoken out on loads of different platforms. So have you ever just said, Dad, watch this interview, let me know what you think?
I only did it once where for the A&E one where it was against, Sean Moon and his gun cult. I told my family about that because it was like a splinter group and I figured they're probably not for that. But everything else, I just don't show them, and I rely on their being older and being kind of afraid of technology to to not come across it. Maybe one of their friends will send something, but there was actually one time where like I wasn't aware that they would see it. I did, let's see, right after Trump was elected, I wrote an article, I contributed to the Huffington Post about comparing Trump to Sun Myung Moon and like Trump's followers to the Unification Church. And my parents are Trump supporters, and which has been hard ever since he's been elected. They've always been into Fox News, and it basically, the Unification Church is a far right cult that gives a lot of money and has contributing entities and figures to the far right. They're an engine for the far right. That's how I describe them. And the Washington Times is, for example, is a Mooney paper. But so when he saw that, I was like, that hit me really hard, and I kind of got into a fight and blew up, and they were like, I was like, Dad, this changes everything. Like, now you know how I really feel and how strongly I feel about it. And he's like, no, I don't think it changes. And I was like, I think my parents are just, they, when you're so used to living in a bubble where you get taught not to trust your own instincts anymore. You don't understand the impact of things like that. You're just like, oh, he'll come around, or, oh, I don't know if that's, so it's hard to talk to them about stuff like that. That's why I don't bring it up. And I don't feel like their feet are like planted in the ground enough. They rely on things like Fox News and like kind of far right outlets and some woo-woo entities here and there. They've been in a lot of like multi-level marketing things. They're in one now, and I think it's a whole world. It's not even about Republican or Democrat. It's about like trusting fringe more than trusting, what's like mainstream, quote unquote. So, that's kind of what I see in them and why I can't just talk to them easily.
Yeah. It's just something I was wondering about, because you're such a such a powerful voice behind all of the raising awareness around the Unification Church, that I wondered if it was inevitable that they would see something, whether you'd had that discussion or not. So that's interesting. And you mentioned before, when you were growing up as kids and just kind of having access to these beautiful spaces and kind of all having the opportunity to be together and play together, and it all sounds very pure and innocent, sort of, you have no idea at this point the kind of the church that you're growing up in, I suppose. Is there a point that you can recall where that changed, where you started having that maybe seeds of doubt, or thinking, I don't know if that's sort of the same as everybody else in my school and things like that?
Yeah. I think when we moved to Seattle, like my family got distance from Seattle, because that community doesn't really have like, it's a little more spread out. It's a little more loose. And there's church veterans who live there who, again, were in the first wave of Unification Church. So they're kind of over it, and they saw how it changed and became more about money and power. Whereas I guess when it first started, it was a little more small and like, a little more wholesome, I guess, in a way. So when we moved to Seattle, I got some distance from the church, and I realized that the Moons, who, I grew up near, that I was like, it's wrong that they were really violent, and like they would beat up people who would express an opinion. Like, they beat up teenage boys, like who corrected them or said something they didn't like my older brother's friends. So getting distance from it, we moved when I was 13 or 12, 13, sometime around then. I just started developing like away from this concentrated, headquarters of the church. And I started to meet people in high school, and it was like really, like, actually no one knew about the Moonies in Seattle, or it had already been kind of like old news from the 80s. And this was in like the early mid 90s. And so I was like, oh, okay, well, I guess I just have to kind of start over. And I just started getting to know people. And that was it. It was just realizing that, there's like nice people in the world. And I started to think like, wow, like I give the church all my trust and identity and everything, and like there's people who don't even care about all these rules and stuff in the real world. And so I would say, yeah, maybe high school, that's where I started to kind of loosen up, and it started loosening its hold on me. Yeah.
What was the reason for the move to Seattle? Was that through your parents' responsibility to the church?
Yeah, it was purely because Sun Moon's, he wanted to spread the witnessing effort. So he said, move to your father's hometown. And so it was sad. It was like all of our, all my childhood friends, the only people I was like concentrated on trusting, we all had to break up. And it was rough. And yeah, so we just moved there, and it was very sobering. And no more fancy properties and stuff. It was just like we were the older brothers and sisters. We were one of the older families. I think most of the older families lived in New York. So we had to like be the older brothers and sisters who had these like meetings and events with the kids, and, be in a position of responsibility. So
I wonder what types of conversations your parents had behind closed doors when you were children, things that they might have protected you from when they thought, like, oh, we're going to have to leave everything. The kids are going to have to leave everything, but we have to do this because we're committed to changing the world for the better. So in order to do that, we have to move to. So I wonder how difficult or easy those decisions were, not just for your parents, but for all of the families that are asked to do such massive tasks and to commit to such huge changes because their movement asks them to. I just wonder, when I speak to, I just recently finished an interview with a woman who was in Scientology, and she joined the Sea Org when she was 13, and her mother signed over guardianship to somebody that this 13-year-old had never met before. And I think only ended up meeting 2 or 3 times in her time in the Sea Org. And we talked a lot about, what her mum might have been thinking or feeling, and the relationship with her and her mum now, and all those things. And I just wonder what conversation the mother had with herself when she was about to sign those papers, and think, but this is what Scientology is asking of me and my child. And in order for us to change the world for the better in the way that Scientology wants to do it, as opposed to the Unification Church, this is what we have to do, and this is what we have to commit to. So it's for somebody on the outside, because we'll never know the answers to those questions. It's always something I want to know more about. I just finished watching the Cecil Hotel documentary on Netflix, and the unsolved mystery of what really happened with Elisa Lam is something that everybody in the unsolved mystery community wants to know about. That's one of the big ones that everybody wants to know the real answers to. And because we will never know, it's human nature for everybody to want to know even more so what really happened. So I really do wonder if your parents spoke about it. Maybe they never spoke about it, and it was like this big unspoken thing that happened where you just packed up and left. I don't know. What do you think?
I would think, yeah, maybe I would refer to maybe like my mom having more instincts than my dad. I think my dad just did whatever the church told him. Like they adopted him pretty much, and he was very not connected with the kids and what we wanted. So but my mom might have probably thought of that a bit more. But yeah, like they didn't sit us down and be like, I know this is going to be really hard or whatever. And I kind of got mad at them for that, like years later, like well into adulthood. And like, you don't know what it's like for us. And, they just seem to, I don't know. I did like a hand swiping over my head motion. I think because whatever experience we had in the church or that we're angry about, like they know that they chose this church, or, you know, they think they chose it, but there's like a process of cult indoctrination. But anyway,
Mhm.
yeah. So no, they, you know, I think they just like, a lot of that gets thrown out the door when you join a cult. Like there's no consideration for personal feelings, and um, you can't really have your own life. You can't really think. It's just they're like, okay, we have to do this now, and because the Messiah told us we have to do it, everything's going to be fine, and we're all going to adjust. And you know, I don't know. I mean, I think it varies between families. Again, like the difference between my mom and my dad. Like some people had really good parents in the church, and they just kind of had a more kind of loose relationship with the church. And yeah, I think everyone's opinion about the church, a lot of it depends on their own family experience. Like that's kind of a pattern I see. So yeah, it just, I don't know. There wasn't a lot of talk about it. I mean, all the kids were kind of sad, and
Yeah.
um, I don't know. We never grieved in our family. Like,
Yeah, that's another thing. I've just released an episode from another person that I interviewed from Scientology, and he spoke a lot about how he is only now grieving the childhood that Scientology took from him. And that's something that his therapist is helping him work through, you know, the fact that there is something to grieve, even though he's still here physically. There was so much of his life that wasn't really his at such a young age, and all these experiences that he missed out on, that he is now going through that grieving process. So I mean, well, you mentioned that there are things that you were angry about with growing up, being involved in the Unification Church, and I wonder if there's things that your parents are angry about as well. I just think there's so many things parents don't tell their children, and I just really wonder if your parents are as passive about it as you think they are. I don't know. It's just really, I'm just speculating. But you have recently, well, I was reading something that you've recently written, which I found on medium.com, called "Extremism is a Team Sport." And in that, you used the phrase "Mooniverse," and I smiled when I read that, because I wondered if that was a term that you'd created or something that is used within the Unification Church.
yeah, someone else asked me about that too. I was like, whoops, shouldn't have used it. That's totally my own word. I don't know. Yeah.
So
No.
Mooniverse is one of your terms, but was there any language that's used within the Unification Church that somebody like myself might not understand straight away?
Yeah, well, the church uses, or Moon used the word true for everything. That was kind of his appropriated brand name for everything. He's like, true love. That's what you find in the church. Or like, you know, they changed the name God's Day, which is New Year's Day, to True God's Day. Like, it's like, we're going to make true families and in a true world. And it's so, and then it's like, things that are just are. You don't have to add anything, and that's how you can tell it's phony. So anyway, but like, so yeah, there's true on everything. He called his family the True Family, which is hardly, they're toxic as hell. And like, let's see, well, the fact that it comes from Korea and there's a lot of Japanese members, is there's a lot of broken English terms that just stuck. Like there's this word heartistic. It's like, we have to have a heartistic attitude. And like sometimes I catch some of my ex-Mooney friends saying that, and I'm like, oh, don't. Like, anyway, artistic. There's all these weird like pseudoscience, kind of philosophies from the divine principle, which is the Bible of the Unification Church, which is basically a mixture of like Christianity and Confucianism, which is kind of what Sun Myung Moon grew up with. So we grew up with these like charts, these scientific looking charts of like, you know, there's the 4-position foundation, which is like God on the top, and then husband and wife in the middle as these two bubbles, and then child is on the bottom. And it's like this cycle of, you know, harmony. And it's like you don't need a chart for that, bro. Like, I don't know. There's like give and take, like we need to have give and take, and like mind body unity, like duality was a huge theme in the church. Just like, protons and electrons, we have to have like man and woman. But where it got dark was like, there's like this subject object relationship, right? Like where there's a subjugator and there's the follower. And so one of the things they taught was in a relationship, man is the subject, woman is the object. And so a lot of women, like later on, who I talked to online, who grew up in the Moonies, like were like, I went home and cried when I heard about that. Like I told my mom, like, I don't want to be an object. And it makes me so angry to think about. It's so disgusting. So anyway, yeah. I'm trying to think of any more like crazy term. Oh, there's something called like universal prime force, which I don't even know what it is, but it's another bloated bag of hot air. Basically, it probably just means like synergy or something. I don't know. But,
Sounds like something from the Transformers universe.
Or Scientology, yeah. Maybe they like borrowed some terms. I don't know.
Yeah, I think they all kind of dip in and out of each other's textbooks here and there. Especially Nexium. Nexium seems to be a combination of just all the worst parts of every single high control group that's ever existed. But if you think of any more while we go, just let me know. And I'll keep going through all of these questions. I did actually mention in my email, I asked you if you had any idea of the numbers of the Unification Church, and you came back to me and said that there's no way to know for sure how many official members there are of the church, because the numbers are most likely manipulated to look a certain way.
Yeah, there's no accuracy. But I will say there's one guy, I think his name is Michael Mickler, and he is like the documenter of the church. Like he actually writes some accurate, so I guess I'll take that back a little. At least he, like, it almost makes me wonder how much in the church he is. I'm like, what? He's not lying. It doesn't sound like he's lying. Like he's talking critically about the church. So he talks about like the history of the Unification Church and what worked when. And I think there's a book called like The History of the Unification Church he wrote. And it actually talks about where the labor trafficking started and where just having brick and mortar shops for the Unification Church ended, because it made a lot more money. And that's when things got, put in fifth gear and kind of nasty. But yeah, so no, they just... who knows? There's so much narcissism and so much grandiosity that there's just no way of telling. But there's enough to build, international businesses and to influence politics. And there's like True World Foods, which is, I think, probably still the number one distributor of fish to sushi restaurants in America. Last I read, I think it was over 9,000 restaurants they distribute fish for. I think it started because Sun Myung Moon, he liked fishing. And so everyone's like, oh, it's this holy thing that we all have to do. And then they make this empire of a company because this one guy likes fishing. So I don't know. It did really well. But and it's successful, and they have a handful of successful businesses. But what I don't like is it's all based on labor trafficking. That's how they get ahead. There's no venture capitalists to invest in the business. It's people like you and me who get coerced away from their families and then eventually live in a van where for years, sometimes over a decade, people will be selling door to door, making money for the church and only like spending enough on themselves to get fast food or, whatever they need to help sell better the next day, That's their venture capitalists. It's slavery, basically. So, yeah.
I remember watching something briefly with Stephen Hassan when he mentioned that he was out selling door to door with his team and on the streets, and they were all so exhausted that he ended up in a car accident. And it was actually in the hospital where he got to have some rest and eat properly and see his family that that he was like, oh, that's something's not right. I shouldn't have to do all of those things to appease the church I'm a part of. How does that make the world a better place? Bringing in money for the church and then not knowing what that money's being used towards in terms of changing the world for the better, which is very similar to Scientology and the Sea Org and the types of labor that they have the Sea Org members carry out, and then there's not much record of that money being used to, I don't know, feed the hungry, educate people that might not have the opportunity to obtain any kind of education. So I mean, you talk about labor trafficking in the sense of people going out and selling things and kind of living a really basic life. Even it's like even living in your car is like a homeless lifestyle almost, isn't it? Like you're living in your van and kind of going meal to meal, just trying to make this money for the church. What is the youngest we know of people being labor trafficked in the Unification Church?
Well, there's a program called STF, or Special Task Force. It's kind of like what the Mormons do after you graduate high school. It could be a year or 2 years or however long you want to do it, which can become a trap if you have that kind of mentality, where you get a taste of, like, quote unquote, the front line of the church, where you witness on college campuses but it's mostly fundraising, mostly doing what's called MFT, or mobile fundraising teams. That's what they call it. It's basically labor trafficking. And so, I did that. I did that for a year and a half. And like, I'd say maybe half the time, or maybe more than half the time, you sleep in a motel. Everyone just sneaks in to like 1 or 2 rooms. That's how they do it. And like, to save money. But if you didn't do well that day or whatever, you sleep in the van. So, and you just go door to door and you try to sell. You don't really say exactly what it's for. You say, like, I'm doing this for like a student group or something like that. And we sold little trinkets like keychains or like wind chimes. So, and some of the really culty parts are like when it's all cash, and like there's no tax or anything, it's really freaking illegal. But one of the culty things is like you have to unfold all the like corners of the dollar bills and make them flat so that they're like presentable, because it's like holy money. There's little things like that. But another thing I was going to mention before this is like, I think most people would be like, how could anyone be convinced to do that? Like, no one wants to live their life doing that. So I saw this documentary recently on the Reels channel, the REELZ. It's just called Moonies, Cult of Personality. Cult of Personality is like their cult documentary series. And I didn't know this before, but so Sun Myung Moon was in a prison camp in North Korea. I think at the time, this is when he was younger, and he still lived in Korea. I think the North Koreans thought he was like a spy from South Korea, and he could have been. It could have been in some CIA stuff. And he basically, so I think in North Korea, it's kind of like in China, where there's this indoctrination thing that happens in jail. It's like their way of trying to reform people and make them better. So there's like a method to it where you kind of have people go from like, you just kind of exhaust them until they have to accept, what they're presented. So according to this documentary, Sun Myung Moon took those methods and he brought them into the, American witnessing effort in these retreat centers, in like Boonville, California. That was a big one. I think that's probably where my dad went. And they would do stuff like from lecture to lecture. They would just like go from lecture to lecture, and they do these like exhaustive physical exercises. There's something called choo choo pow, where they would just hold hands and go choo choo pow, choo choo pow. It's basically it basically like pushes out any space you have to like think for yourself or process anything. And I've also heard they had like low protein foods so that, you didn't have a lot of empowerment, even physically, in those centers. But yeah, when I heard it came from North Korea, I was like, wow, like, there you go. That's so, one thing I also learned about brain science, like in this whole cult research stuff, is that like your brain actually like physically changes to adapt to whatever environment you're in so that it works in that, for survival. So your neural pathways will reform to kind of adjust to like, survive in that world. And that's where, people become convinced to be labor trafficked and feel like it's the right thing to do, because everyone around them in that closed environment is like, yeah, this is best thing we can do for the world. So yeah,
I think there's a big misconception. I've spoken about this a few times on other episodes, but there's a big misconception around the type of person that can be indoctrinated or become a victim of thought reform. And that is that the person has to be kind of weak-willed or lower in intelligence or gullible. And it's not that at all. I mean, I'm talking to yourself now. I recently spoke to Dr. Yanya Lalich as well, and she's clearly not on the lower level of intelligence, and she is obviously not a weak-willed woman either. But so many of the people I've spoken to, so many of the cult experts and advocates like yourself that speak out are clearly not the stereotypical people that the general public may assume are gullible enough, in inverted commas, to be brought into these things. And the reason that it happens is much like what you've just said. It's a very specific methodology that's put in place to almost change your brain chemistry. And there's so many different techniques that are used that you don't even have a chance to realize what's happening to you before it's already happened. And it could be anything from moving to a new city and not knowing anybody and being loved bombed by the local Christian Bible group or library study group or yoga group or the people at the fresh fruit and veg stand, or I don't know what. Yeah, all the way through to things like bereavement or mental illness or just a change in jobs, or just like your father was, just young. You described him as a hippie, somebody who might just be seeking something, looking for something, not quite sure what it is. And it can be anybody in any of these transitional periods, no matter how minor or major that period is, where they're kind of swooped up into these situations. And it's something I think we've touched upon quite a lot in terms of trying to change the perception on the type of person that can be indoctrinated, because at the end of it all, the answer, I think, is any person.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, and that's great, and I'm glad that knowledge seems to be kind of getting around more, that it's anyone, and it's not that people are stupid or too poor or whatever. But at the same time, I do think that people who are really hungry for it they're gonna probably fall into it a little more. Or if like someone like my dad who didn't grow up with a lot of stability, and he sees these people who like want him, and it's a stable, he looks around and these nice properties, that's going to be more alluring. So it might happen faster for those people, but it's not a black and white thing. Yeah.